Good afternoon. I'm John Eckenrode. I direct the Bronfenbrenner Center for Translational Research, and I wanted to welcome you here all today. It's really a great honor for me to introduce Professor Frank Furstenberg to you today. His work, as many of you know, bridges the areas of sociology of the family, developmental psychology, social policy, demography, as well as other disciplines as well. Professor Furstenberg is the Zellerbach Family Professor of Sociology and a research associate in the Population Studies Center at the University of Pennsylvania. He received his PhD in sociology from Columbia in 1967, the year he started his academic career at Penn, and where he has remained for his entire career, with other interesting stints along the way. But at least that's where he was. That was his grounding at Penn. He's done groundbreaking and highly influential work in a number of areas, including divorce, teen childbearing, the development of high-risk adolescents in urban settings, among other topics. He's received many awards for his work, including the Distinguished Contributions to Public Policy of Children Award from the Society for Research in Child Development, as well as the John P. Hill Memorial Reward from the Society for Research on Adolescence, among a number of other honors and awards that are too numerous to mention here. He began his seminal study of teen childbearing in Baltimore in the mid-1960s. He formed very many productive collaborative relationships in carrying out that and other work, such as with Jeannie Brooks Gunn and doing the follow-up study in the Baltimore sample, where they re-interviewed the children and mothers over a 30-year period. His work was summarized in 3 seminal books, documenting the social and psychological costs of teen childbearing for mothers and children. But this work in his writing also made clear that an issue like teen parenting is socially constructed. Indeed, his longitudinal work challenged the assumption that teen parenthood was a necessarily disastrous and life-altering course, as many had assumed. On this issue, social scientists didn't always get it right, and politicians, certainly on the right and the left, use the issue of teen parenting to advance other agendas and push for ineffective policies. And some other people in the room have looked into those and have written about that as well, as Frank has. He cogently reminds us that teen childbearing is perhaps only a marker for much more fundamental and toxic issues around poverty and inequality, and in terms of its effects on families and children. In this and other ways, he, like Urey in his career, has navigated the tricky waters that lie between science and social policy. Both he and Urey had a concern for what makes families successful. I think Frank would agree with a quote from Urey from 1973 when he wrote, and I'll quote, this is Urey's quote, "The community, of course, is a family of families, and is there perhaps more than anywhere else that the family needs support. Because of this thesis I am presenting to you is that just as children cannot function unless they have healthy parents and caretakers to deal with them, so these caretakers, parents, and all those who carry the responsibility for children in society need support of the community and of the society in order for them to be able to function effectively in their roles. It is not the family that is breaking down. It is not the staff of people engaged in work with children that is breaking down. It is the support in the society for the family and for those who are faced with the responsibility and delight of raising a new generation of human beings that is being withdrawn." Now, in today's lecture, Professor Furstenberg will discuss families and how and why we went from a relatively undifferentiated family system in the middle of the last century to the present system of diverse family forms. He will explain how this change is a result of adaptation by individuals and family members to changing economic, demographic, technological, and cultural conditions. In this way, his discussion fits squarely into Urey's ecology of human development framework. So on behalf of the Bronfenbrenner Center, and I would ask you to please help me welcome Frank Furstenberg to the microphone.
Well, thank you, John, for that very nice introduction. And you're right, Urey Bronfenbrenner I would have concurred with that comment when it was written, and I did concur with that comment when it was written. Indeed, Yuri was one of the people who had a profound influence on my intellectual life, and I have many fond memories of serving with Yuri, where I first met him on the Committee on Public Policy and Child Development back in the early 80s, I guess. I can't quite reconstruct exactly the date. I probably could do so with a little research. But I was awed by Yuri then, and just 30 years ago exactly, Yuri led a tour to the National Academy of Social Sciences in the Soviet Union. And I was lucky enough to be asked to go on that tour. Michael Lewis, Robert, I'm trying to remember all the names of the people who went along. There were about 7 or 8 of us. Jalen Mortimer, Rich Lerner, I think, went. And in any case, it was a wild, and maybe I'll save some stories for dinner, but there was a lot of laughter and a certain amount of being bucked up by Yuri on that trip, which was, the Soviet Union was dismal in those days, and I couldn't wait to leave. But I have many fond memories of Yuri and that trip, as well as being here on the campus and singing at some conference with Yuri. He was a really profound influence on my life. So I'm quite honored to be here and to be presenting this lecture in his memory. I wish he were here in the audience still. Now I'm going to talk about a big picture, and I'm going to largely describe rather than show very complicated causal models of. This is an exercise in descriptive demography to some extent, and it pieces together work that I've been doing for an awfully long time. So I'll mention the Baltimore study and a number of other studies that I've participated in, but it's not so much to talk about my work as to talk about what's happened to families over the course of 50 years. When I was a graduate student at Columbia, I got interested in this topic taking a course with William J. Good, and who was then the preeminent authority on family change, and wrote a very important book that has survived the test of time and is just 50 years old this year, World Revolution and Family Patterns. And in that book, Good describes a system that is, this is 1963, a world system that is converging to the Western model of family behavior. Now, Good wasn't totally wrong, but I'll try to say a little bit more about where he missed where his vision was misleading and outright incorrect. So I'm going to talk about the growing process of diversification, starting at this base point. And many people have pointed out that mid-century 1950s is not the logical base point to chart family change. family has been changing for countless countless decades and many centuries since its very beginning, and to somehow make the family of the post-war family as the model of the American family in our historical memory is misleading. But it was an important transition point, and it did signal a sharp and very rapid change. I used to say the family, in articles, the family has changed more in the last 20 years than in any comparable era of American history, and it was always true. But now, I think I can only chart this change over the last 50 years, and I'm going to try to give you some perspective on why the change has occurred and what both why it's happening and what some of the consequences are when I talk about some work that I've and others have done, many of whom are sitting in this room, on multiple partner fertility. So I will come to that in due time. But the context for the talk, I think, is certainly the 50 years of not only family change, but certainly 30, 40 years of growing inequality, and 50 years if you count it from the point of view of children. So that's my goal, and there's a long paper, 30-page paper, that goes with the talk and may make some sense of what I'm going to try to do in this rather cursory fashion. So let's begin with the post-war family system. It's hard to believe that I grew up in this system and that it was very much, as I've already signaled, taken for granted as the evolution of the American family in particular, and the Western family more in general, as Good argued in his book. There were, by today's standards, a great deal of homogeneity in certainly the beginnings of family formation, where virtually everyone, 97% of women married in the 1950s, an extraordinary figure, just to have 97% do anything in America in similar ways. Virtually that high a level had children, and most of those children were in wedlock. So the family system was relatively uniform across social class. There were, to be sure, important class differences in rates of timing of marriage and rates of divorce and instability. But by today's standards, all of those things look quite benign. When I began my study of teenage childbearing, there were the level that was exciting the public alarm of non-marital childbearing, and the rate of non-marital childbearing is now higher among whites than it was among African Americans in the early 1960s. So in some sense, Good's book there was an ironic quality to it, because he was anticipating a level of cross-national consensus in patterns that were quickly overthrown almost by the time the book was published, not quite. By certainly 5 years later, he would have had some deep and serious misgivings to write this kind of, certainly the description of the family system as a kind of stable institution. It was anything but. He did not anticipate the gender revolution, even though the first signs were cropping up. And I might say that hardly anybody else did either. I don't think all of that came out in the reviews of the book, which were largely laudatory, very laudatory. The change that I'm about to discuss is called by demographers the second demographic transition, because it ushered in a host of shifts in the way that people did family, and demographers like to think of this as a kind of coherent package of changes. I think the evidence is beginning to suggest that the package isn't quite as coherent as we've sometimes believed. But nonetheless, there is a very, very sharp departure from the mid-1960s right up to the present. And I'm going to show you a set of slides. Don't worry about reading them on the bottom or different countries. The red line is the OECD average, but it just shows how steep the decline in crude marriage rate has become. And it's not, and this is the important point, an American phenomenon. This is not something that is unique or particularly characteristic of American families. It is very widespread. It spans now Eastern and Western Europe, and indeed a good deal of the nations in Asia are experiencing many of the same changes with different sorts of dilemmas, and we can get into that in the discussion, but I don't have time to talk about it. I'm going to show you just some of the changes here. This is the proportion of people in a first marriage at a given point in time, and you can see over time with the blue, if you can read the legend there. These are sort of this is measuring change over time, the length of the lines, and you can see the drop that is occurring in the last measurement point, which was like 2008. So this is a very, don't look this way, that's countries arrayed, but look on the vertical axis. And another picture cross-nationally of the increase in crude rates of divorce. And it doesn't really matter how we would measure these. I put these slides on because I could find them. But all of these changes, I want to give you a good picture of how widespread this and how large the change has been. I mean, it's both almost universal across developed nations, the economies of developed and advanced developing nations, and it's very steep. Yet another picture. I'll stop this after a while, but I thought it would be more interesting to kind of see this. This would be a more effective visual presentation. Here's the change in the out of wedlock births, and so you look at the bottom of each of these bars, and that is the 1970 and The change, the white is, the gray is the change between 70 and 95, and the black is the change between 95 and 2008. And you can see just in every country, less so in Greece and Cyprus and a little less in Switzerland, though Switzerland is changing pretty rapidly. The postponement of first birth, same thing, same huge change. These are just a list of changes that make up what we call the second demographic transition. Total fertility rates, everybody in here knows how steep the decline has been, but the decline is, this decline is almost universally steep. It's especially so in Asia, which represents a very interesting case, as I already mentioned, and will be a center of some of my research in the future. But this is the proportion of childless women at age 40, less dramatic because of the way the vertical axis, the legend of the vertical axis, but it's pretty widespread, and in most advanced economies, it's pushing up toward 20%. And that's think about the 1950s, America 1950s, where only 4% didn't marry and something like 6 or 7% didn't have children. I show this last slide just to show you how complicated the picture can be. Because in 1980, there was a inverse relationship between the percentage of women working and the fertility rate, showing one pattern. By 2010, the relationship has reversed, and fertility and women's work are positively related at a country level, and this throws into question a lot of the research that has been done that assumes a constant relationship between X and Y, and it's not historically constant, and much of what I will say about marriage fits this pattern in a moment. So here's a recent slide that I don't think any of you have seen, I don't think, that Sheila Kennedy at the University of Minnesota and I are updating some work we did 10 years ago when the GSS, the General Social Survey, collected some data for us, and we also did some analysis of census data to map the changes that had occurred in the demographic markers of the transition to adulthood. And that work was published way long, 10 years ago. But we've now updated it with the recent census and now a new module in the General Social Survey that the MacArthur Network on the transition to adulthood footed the bill for. And so I'm just showing how much the life course, the timing of life course events and whether they ever occur has changed since 1960. And if you look at the drop in people negotiating traditional markers, that is leaving home, finishing your education, not necessarily in that order, but finishing your education, leaving home, living with a partner, having a child, getting a job. Those are the 5 traditional markers. How much that's changed by age for both men and women, and I'll show another version of this in a little bit. But you can see that the ability to become incorporated in the larger society has at least its timing, has changed profoundly by a considerable degree. Okay, so these are the major, just to sum up. I don't know whether, can you read these? Okay, good. So over the past 50 years, we've seen a breakdown of the link between sex and marriage, where marriage is no longer the prelude to sex, either to sexual initiation. That's gone. We hardly even talk about it anymore, whereas 50 years ago it was the major public discussion topic. Postponement of demographic transitions, the weakening of the institution of marriage, which all of you know about and I will talk more about, what I dramatically call the breakdown of the gender-based division of labor, the delay of family formation and with it lower fertility, the growth in non-marital childbearing, and so on and so forth. So it's led to well-known European demographers, Francesco Billary and Art Leaf Brewer, to talk about at a country level, a convergence to divergence. So all European countries have become more diverse in their patterns of forming families and the relationship of sex, marriage, and childbearing. And I will talk today about something that's very much on the public agenda, which is the widening of social class differences and the emergence of what I refer to, for lack of a better term, a two-tiered family. There's now the luxury model of marriage and childbearing, and there's your standard model of doing the best you can through cohabitation, and cohabitation becoming a kind of hedge against the ability to make a stable and lasting marriage. That's one description of cohabitation. So how and why did this change occur? And as I said, we can trace its origins to the late 60s. We begin to see the shift around, and so there are various kinds of explanations. Charles Murray would say it had to do, he starts his book Coming Apart with a description of the state of American families in 1963, and that's when this all began and the culture went wild, and these changes were the product of a disorganized culture. I see it differently. I think in some ways C. Wright Mills had it right when, in this quote, that change occurs when there are cultural contradictions and paradoxes, and when time-honored traditions can no longer be honored. And I'm going to argue that this is just what happened. The pattern that was so familiar in the 1950s of early marriage, remember that in the year 1957, half of all marriages occurred by age 20. By age 20. And I mean, that's a figure that I sometimes tell younger people, and they just shake their head in wonderment. How could it happen? And how could it happen what we took so much for granted? And I had as I like to say, I had a ringside seat because I had just started the Baltimore study, and I was watching what was happening in the black family, which was to be a couple of years later, or really just about the time I started this study, Moynihan wrote his famous treatise on the black family, and decrying the rising rates of what was called in those days illegitimacy, a term that has now become somewhat archaic. But I was watching these families doing interviews. I wasn't literally watching them. I was doing interviews of pregnant teens and their mothers, and getting a glimpse of their conversations, which went something like this: don't get married just to give the child a name. You don't need to get married. Wait until he has a regular job or completes his education to marry. These conversations were going on. The teenagers were much more interested in getting married, I think, than the parents, who had often gone through the experience of an early marriage and subsequent breakup. But I began to argue with the black teenagers that I was studying. The whites were still getting married at that time. We had 20% of the sample in Baltimore was white, and virtually all of those people got married or dropped out of the study, meaning they went to California to deliver their child for somebody's adoption. But I would say the logic of marriage did not make sense. It became clear that the men and the fathers of these births and the mothers were in no position to support a family, and the women generally began to opt to stay with their mothers rather than to marry immediately, or they became the fragile families of today. I will talk later on, it's just a tag here, about the differences in the changes between advantaged and disadvantaged families. So here's a little Bronfenbrenner with the language of macro, meso, and micro, and it just reflects Urey's enduring influence. But there were big changes afoot in the legal system. There were changes coming about because of the massification of American society and the building of consumer markets. There were legal and political changes, all of which were important. The economic changes being, I think, most important. It was quick, jobs were going offshore. We know the story very well, what was happening at that point. We have not sufficiently, I think, rigorously linked it to the changes that were happening in the family, but I have no doubt from the Baltimore study that the absence of what were deemed to be marriageable partners who had prospects either then or would have them in a few years, those conditions had changed by the middle 60s. Certainly they had changed in Baltimore, where good-paying manufacturing jobs had all but disappeared. So then there is we really need to talk about a category of explanations that are at the meso level, such as the expansion of schooling and the growth of childcare systems. And these are institutional factors, structural factors that really began to differ by social class and began to differ by, let's say, policy regime when we do comparisons across nations. And as Tom Cook and I have argued elsewhere that these institutional responses very much influence, along the lines of your quote, very much influence the stability of the family and the habits of the family, the practices. But just to take an example, as education becomes more and more deemed more and more necessary, the idea of marrying at 20 becomes less and less plausible. I mean, that's a fairly simple-minded way to put it, but I think it's true. So individuals were beginning to face novel situations, and the family has always been an adaptive institution, and it adapts to the realities of the immediate ecology in rather quickly. That's happened through history. We can show it through history, but the kinds of adaptations are relatively modest. What happened in the 60s was that they were very fundamental, and they began to really, I would say, Andy Cherlin talks about the deinstitutionalization of marriage. I would say it's been reinstitutionalized, but in different ways in different social strata. So marriage was no longer a plausible response to, let's say, a premarital pregnancy, which initiated about half of all the early marriages back in the 1950s, believe it or not. I mean, it was virtually, as I've written, a part of our courtship system, pregnancy and marriage. Instead of, love might have been there some way. All right, for reasons that I never fully understood when I made this slide, I made it to dramatically introduce each point, but I find it too irritating, and I can't keep up with with my slides. So the big point here is in the title. Change really occurred differently during this period of the 1970s, 80s, 90s, right up until the present, and it continues to occur very differently for the privileged and the disadvantaged. And there is, of course, during this same time, a pulling apart of an economic widening of inequality. And for the poor, it meant that marriage became unattainable. And for the well-off, it meant that marriage had to be delayed. Those were two different adaptations, and we shouldn't be surprised about this. When we read the history of when we read family history, we find almost invariably that social class or religious differences or some structural differentiation mediates the kind of changes that occur, and quite often you will find reverse changes occurring, as I showed with the fertility patterns earlier. So we began to see the emergence of a two-tier family system. Was it a cultural change or a structural change? I've already referred to this debate. I think it's a mindless debate. I find it distracting, much as the debate, should we do quantitative or qualitative research. Obviously, both of these things are contributing, but the question is how they work together and not how they work individually. They're almost invariably yoked together, cultural and structural change, and they, I think, more often than not, structural change initiates cultural change, but it can be the other way around. And actually, Good recognized this way back in 1963 when he wrote his book. But I think there is ongoing reciprocal change between inequality and family change that continues and maybe becomes more pronounced over time. Those traditional markers that I showed you before, I've just calculated. Sheila Kennedy and I have calculated. Sheila Kennedy has calculated, and I've looked at. Truth in advertising here. These changes by education, and I realized once we did this that I really need to make it go till age 40, not age 35. A lot of the action for college graduates are, of course, occurring in the late 30s. You know this from firsthand experience. So what was this uniform pattern in 1960 among men, I just show it among men for simplification, it was pretty uniform. There wasn't all that much social class difference if we used education as an indicator. By the present, by 2010, you begin to see it. If I took this to age 40, it would be steeper still, because many of the people who have less than high school or even some college will never marry, and a growing number probably won't become parents. So let's spend a moment on the system of the advantage. I've already said long and late transitions, very high level of social support from parents, which is sustaining this. Indeed, it would not be too dramatic to say that the job description of parents has been rewritten in the past 30 years. So a much longer tour of duty. And any parent with young adults, I won't ask for a show of hands, but any parent with young adults knows this. Even parents with older adults know that the flow continues to go downward. But the interesting part of this story is the demographers, the family demographers in here know all too well, is that among the privileged, marriage has become more stable. We enter it later with more due diligence, more search behavior, more refined search. And so it's entered later with better decisions. And as a result, I think it's become more stable, partly out of just the sheer selection. But it's also altered in meaning. Marriage is no longer, I like to say this and keep saying it until other people start saying it, and then I'll stop. Marriage is no longer an expression of a commitment as so much as a celebration. It's not a pledge of commitment, it's a celebration of commitment, increasingly. So people are getting married after they've time-tested the marriage. And there's ever higher investment in children, as you probably know, and as part of the popular culture discussion. But this is a table from an article in Demography that appeared this year that Sabino Cornich and I wrote, Sabino now at Emory, and it just shows the spending by income decile changing, which is at the bottom, income decile, and different cohorts of parents from the survey of economic expenditures. And it shows at the top, in the top deciles, parents are really fanning out in the investments they're making. This is certainly an incomplete accounting of parental investment because it comes from a survey that only contains limited set of questions, but it shows, I think, what is probably happening more broadly, that per child investment among the advantaged has gone up way high, mostly because the incomes have gone up way high, not because people are spending more. There's low income and high income spend roughly the same percentage of their income on their children, but there's a lot more in the top decile to spend. We know all too little about working in true middle income, middle class families. We know that they're coming up short, and I am engaged in a qualitative comparison of Canada and the US. I would have liked to have extended it to other countries and didn't get the funding to do so, but I'd like to be in Scandinavia and Northern Europe and even Southern Europe with this sort of study, but we're looking at how families manage expenditures for children and how much pressure and strain they feel. There was no question, and I'm writing a piece about this now, that there is a big difference in perceived economic strain among families situated similarly in Canada and the US, with very otherwise rather similar cultural systems, but Canada pays for health expenses and a lot of educational expenses as well. And it results in much less perceived anxiety and apprehension on the part of Canadian parents. We know that there's a very difficult transition to adulthood among, let's say, the working poor, I'll get to them in a moment, but let's say working class and middle income families, that education has simply become less attainable, easily attainable. So it's been stretched out, it's been degraded to some extent, and we're currently now studying how families and children in Philadelphia are managing. One of my former graduate students, Laura Napolitano, who's now at Rutgers, now at Camden, Rutgers, is leading a study that looks at how families are dealing with the educational dilemma. Middle-income families are dealing with the educational dilemma. But we've seen, of course, of the rapid growth in cohabitation and in the early part of family formation, with marriage coming later or not at all. And this is changing the landscape for our middle class in profound ways. And I'm not calling upper middle class here middle class. I'm calling it upper middle class privilege. Well, the family system, which I'm going to talk about for the remaining minutes that I have, of the poor and near poor, there is abundant evidence that many youth are not making a successful transition to adulthood. And family formation occurs as it has for a long time now, often before economic settling, which remains a large problem, but the rate of unintentional pregnancies among the working poor and the very poor is extremely high. Racial differences have diminished, but class differences, I think, have grown. What has occurred, and I began to think about this a little bit at the tail end of when I was writing up the results of the last wave of the Baltimore study, I discovered that a very small percentage of the male offspring, now in their late 20s, had contributed to the substantial number of the births that had occurred. And there was clearly a pattern of what had been teenage childbearing and now is just young childbearing, extending into the early 20s, where people had children before they were in a position to do so. And we can talk about this more later on. But the point here is it has led to a growing kind of pattern of, for lack of a better term, I call multi-partnered fertility. Other people like the idea of childbearing across partnerships. Betty Thompson at Wisconsin has pushed me to use that term, and I'm beginning to do it. Here's a slide just showing, now you have to look at this as sort of in the opposite pattern. This is the proportion of multi-partnered fertility and it's the proportion not having a birth. So read it in the opposite way, meaning that almost 60% of black males, 15 years outside of the first birth that occurred, have had another child with a different partner, compared to just the 40%, 20% of whites, so about double or almost triple the percentage. So multi-partnered fertility has become very common among, increasingly common in the bottom tier of families. It occurs, to be sure, among the privileged, but it usually occurs in the context of marriage or marriage-like relationships. And among lower income people, it occurs in the context often of single and unstable cohabitational relationships. So what do we know about the consequences of multi-partnered fertility? This has become a hot topic in social demography. I'm happy to say it's time for me to get out of this area and leave it to people who are willing to study more carefully than I was some of the consequences. There are theoretical reasons for suspecting, and I list them here, for suspecting that we would see a burgeoning of problems as children experience the growth of family complexity here, moving from one, perhaps not moving from their household, but parents moving and new siblings coming online that are related in ways, in less clear-cut ways than have occurred previously. Complexity, however, does not necessarily mean a weaker family form, and I think we have to be careful not to simply use it as a substitute, and I said this at the Wisconsin conference on complexity, on family complexity, as a substitute for talking about family types. And of course, the bugaboo that all of us struggle with, selection, is a big part of the story here. I mean, it is not, there's a sorting system that's going on that's leading people with fewer resources, had less coping abilities, less parenting abilities, less interpersonal relationship qualities to have children when they're not prepared, and to go on, to move from one relationship to the next. So part of this is a selection story of people who are who are doing more of childbearing, but are really in a poor position to do it. We used to say that about teenage parents, and in part, as John pointed out, I showed that that was not quite the story. Complexity might be a marker, not necessarily a determinant of how children are doing. So we're beginning to get some literature on this, and there's a recent paper by Dorius and Guzzo, whom I've collaborated, who was one of my postdocs, on this topic, and it's fairly convincing that apart from selection, there really are some that some of these theoretical reasons for expecting that parenting would be less effective, and because of the structural difficulties and the ability of parents to parent together, and the ambiguities of cohabitation, as well as the problems that arise from having to manage to distribute rather meager resources among different households. That's an incredibly difficult problem. And so I think there's some emerging evidence that complexity is creating yet another layer of complexity in this context, is creating another layer of problems. And there's every reason to believe, I lost the title of this, but it's something like family complexity I can't remember that. But I tried to look at this comparatively, and Betty Thompson has really done the seminal work on the cross-national comparisons. Initially, she found that the US was an outlier, and now she's finding that some countries in Eastern Europe have rates that are maybe Russia has rates that are comparable to ours, but the conditions in those countries are similar. A lot of early childbearing, a lot of family, a lot of relational union instability. The product of union instability and early relationships seem to be the formula for creating a lot of high rates of multi-partner fertility. I think we still have to observe whether the consequences are similar in different countries with different levels of multi-partner fertility. But surely the experience of a child whose parents have limited income growing up today is very different from what it was 50 years ago under similar circumstances. Stratification has always mattered, but I think it matters much more today. This is from the paper of Guzzo and controlling for all other things and looking at the level of the number of changes in the family. Guzzo and Dorius and Guzzo find this very strong relationship of multi-partnered fertility to early adolescent sexual debut. So there is, I suspect, something here. Let me come to the concluding comments, and then we'll have some, I think, adequate time for for discussion. We continue to be an outlier because of our high, certainly for our average standard of living, we continue to be an outlier, tolerating higher rates of poverty than any other country, advanced nation, and a nation with an advanced economy. We still have high rates of early and single parenthood, and although the rate of early childbearing is dropping precipitously, and that's a bit of good news for against this rather bleak story that I've been telling in the last hour. But these the characteristics of American fertility process and our highly stratified system is certainly creating family types that will be related to, that both reflect the stratification and will continue to perpetuate and maybe reinforce the stratification in American society. We've been noting lower rates of social mobility in America over time and lower rates of social mobility compared to most countries in Europe. And I think this is going to get worse before it gets better. So what can we do about it? Well, I think we could do I spent some time thinking about this. Of course, we could do economic redistribution, and I favor it, but it's not going to happen. Maybe there'll be some tax reform in the next 5 years, but it's not imminent. Everybody wants to do it, and nobody wants to do it. But we do have a pretty good system of reproductive health service in place. We can make it a lot stronger. It has profound consequences for reducing we've seen a rapid reduction of early childbearing in the teen years and now in early childbearing in the 20s. And that's likely to continue. It's going to help abate the situation somewhat as fewer children occur earlier in life to the poor and the near poor. Whether there's any right time for the poor and near poor to have children is an open question in my mind. There's certainly not a great time, and early may be better for people who want children. Early may be better than late if it's going to come at the expense of being able to earn a living for a single parent. So we've got problems ahead, but I do think there is we do have a strategy in place, and if we can make that strategy more effective and really cut down the rate of unintended childbearing, we can, I think, reduce and abate to some extent the number of children who will end up in complex families. That says very little about what we do about the larger structural problem of social inequality and growing social inequality. Well, I come to the end of my talk. I'm a little late, but I brought it in a reasonable amount of time. So thank you very much, and I'll take questions. Start clapping for myself.
Well, we won't hold up lunch too late, but I want to leave time for some comments and questions from the audience.
I want comments from the social demographers.
The demographers sitting here. I would only ask, Frank, if you will paraphrase the question that's asked, okay, so it comes back into the microphone for
I would be happy to do that.
That would be great.
Back there.
Senator Moynihan identified the welfare system as being a horrible problem for family life in the 60s. Do you think there's been any changes in government assistance that have that has in any way ameliorated the problems he identified?
Well, we now have a system without, I should repeat. The question was, has the welfare system in the past created some of these problems, and did the change in welfare reform reduce the problems, as many people thought it might? And I think the answer is definitely the change in the welfare system. That was much exaggerated in the source of the problems, and we can see that it has not improved the circumstances. Could it account for the decline in early childbearing that we've witnessed? Some conservatives might make that argument, but much of the change occurred before the reform of the 1997 reform of welfare. And I would say probably, I can't answer, actually Dan Lichter's probably in a better position to answer that question than I, but I would say it hasn't improved the circumstances at all. And has it made things worse? Possibly. Certainly today there are an awful lot of families outside of TANF who are just struggling to survive. Other questions? Yes, Kelly?
So I was wondering, it seemed like there were these gradients in family relationships, but now it's just the college grads pulling away. You said a little bit about that sort of middle education group, but is adaptation also a budget model for them, or is it just that marriage is sort of losing its significance?
I think most of those people would like to marry. I think most low-income people would like to marry if they had the wherewithal. I'll tell you a quick anecdote, if I can make anything quick, my wife and I have been mentoring a family, first children, and now we're mostly working with the parents. And these parents, low income, very poor, African-American couple, decided after 17 years of living together to get married. They didn't have the money for the wedding, and so they decided to do it anyhow, which is what they did. And the following year, when it came time to tax, they had continued to file separate returns. The college where our mentee was going picked that up, and suddenly they discovered, because they had married, only because they had married, they owed $5,000 more out of a total income of $40,000. Total income of $40,000, $5,000 out of $40,000 is devastating. They would have, we ended up helping, but that was marriage, contemporary marriage for the poor. It doesn't make economic sense, and that's part of the circumstances. Can we make it make economic sense? Not without a lot of fiddling, and certainly the best policy we've instituted is the earned income tax credit, but the levels, the phase out of that is so low. It's so low that it causes this kind of grief. I think it's largely, if somehow the economy went back to, in our thought experiment, it wouldn't shift the family patterns immediately or profoundly right away, overnight, but I think there would be a drift back toward marriage. There is no reason. It's hard for us to imagine, because marriage has been precipitously declining, that not for it to continue. but I'm not sure. Other trends reverse, and could we, I don't think we can do it by trying to persuade people to marry, as that case that I just cited illustrates. It's a bad idea without more support. Yes?
How powerful a lever do you think education can be in having an impact on these trends?
I don't really know the answer to that question, but it surely, along with reproductive health services, the best tool we have. Education changes practices, or it appears to, in profound ways. It's not surprising people. I think a lot of it has not much to do with what goes on in the classroom, but what goes on outside of the classroom. So we'd expect it to be more powerful when there's a residential model of education than the model that most poor people or near poor people or working class people or even lower middle class people get, which is more living at home and going to school. So would that change practices? I think yes, the answer is, but could we do better? Yes. So if there were a policy of, as maybe emerging, to take more low-income students into better schools, higher tier schools, I think that would help. It would be a good policy, and we would want to be right on top of that, studying those students.
Well, thank you, Frank. I think
It was a
very
pleasure.
much.